Aha. All right, so it doesn't look like we have got any hands or any questions. Anna, you're watching the chat box for me. All right, Robert, let us hear it from the UN perspective, the new colonization. So what are the effects on the current generation in Africa and in Europe, the effects of decolonization? Robert?
Thank you, Mary.
You're welcome.
I'm Robert Toé. I worked for the UN for about 20 years, but now I'm retired. And one of my main focuses was on establishing regional and national volunteer programs. So it was not intentional to work on decolonization, but through the work on establishing this program, you will always come across this topic in a certain way. Because as you know, voluntarism doesn't occur in a vacuum. It's all linked to all the globalization, to the general assistance framework in our different countries. So when we start working on this program, usually you will see, for instance, that very few countries where we have official established volunteer program have mentioned, for instance, the traditional form of volunteers in their program. So it's always a kind of this mentality that what's come from the outside is better than what we already have. So this is one thing we should keep in mind. And then, as a former UN volunteer staff, also, we bring volunteers from countries to countries, and you can see that sometimes there are countries who even said, I don't want to receive a volunteer from country X or country Y. And usually it's when they have a choice between a volunteer, for instance, coming from Africa or Asia or Latin America, and a volunteer coming from Europe. And as Kris said, there's always this issue of inequality, this imbalance of power. So we have many people who think they volunteer if they see it in terms of, I will say, we don't have the same concept of volunteerism. Even though we have in the key concept, I gave this general definition that came out from the UN General Assembly, but you will meet people who are doing volunteerism in Africa who will tell you, I'm not volunteering, because they consider this is not volunteering. So this whole concept of volunteerism need, I think, we have to look at it from a different perspective. Now, on the current situation, I think it's vary also from country to country. If I take West Africa, where most of the country got their independence was given, it's not the same as in Southern Africa, where most of the country had to fight to get their independence. And all this has an impact on the way you will perceive people coming from the former colonizer country. So I think as we go more in depth, we can start to look more deeply to this question. But I saw also that there have been a very short study done in Southern Africa on the colonial legacy of voluntaries. by a university from a professor from the US called Benjamin Liu, and he was trying even to see how many people are coming from the northern countries to the southern country. I think that was in 2010. He came out with a figure more or less of 2,700 people. So it's not that big compared to the million of volunteers working in Africa. And I don't want to monopolize the floor. My last word is that in this international volunteer concept, I think we have to put it in context, because if someone leaves Zimbabwe to go to work in Mozambique is an international volunteer, is it the same situation as someone leaving Belgium? I'm talking Belgium because I just hear Kris talking. Belgium to go to work in Burkina Faso. It will not be the same relationship between the sending organization and the host organization. I think for the time being, I'll stop here unless if you have more precise question.
Okay, thank you, Robert. I just want to remind everybody what informed this webinar. It's in the international volunteer movement, several organizations started questioning the impact of international volunteer projects, and more specifically, the way in which international volunteer projects sustain each colonial relations and power structures, or the power of the international volunteer projects. So really the question is, decolonizing international volunteering, is it a dream or is it a reality? Kris, before we move on, I don't know if you've got any comment on what Robert has just said. Or...
Well, I fully agree on the fact that volunteering concept depends where you live. Huh? Mm-hmm. When for many SCI branches, volunteering is putting people in an enormous work camp industry, in work camp machinery, and organizing alternative holidays for people. Well, I did things in conflict resolution with volunteers in Burundi where people had to take risks, and they risked their life to reach the spot where they were supposed to arrive for training and to work together. I mean, you understand that the level of commitment is not the same. We are talking about something else. So that's very important. So I thank Robert for this. It's for me, it's major. It's a major insight for what we are doing now.
Wow. Okay. Any comments from people in the rooms? Anybody? Sorry, in the room. Yeah. No? Okay. All right, we'll move on. So we've got Sonya. Sonya is here to tell us more or a little bit about her work in decolonizing in life and work environment. So Sonya is from the US, and can you tell us about culture and the influence of decolonization, both perspective, culture and influence?
Yeah, the way I interpret this question is it's also very much linked to the first question that was sent to Kris about the colonial legacies that exist. And I think for us to influence it, whether as individuals or as societies, we have to acknowledge that it exists and have awareness around it. And I think in the work that I do, with organizations mainly in the US and also in Canada, really looking at the colonial legacies of these countries, and particularly in the US, and what it has also become in the world, it's what led me to this work as well. We must, right? It must be intentional in order to start the decolonization process, if you will, and it starts with each of us. What Kris shared really resonated with me because I also grew up in the United States during this time of the 1970s as when I was a child. And my family lived in this, my family came from Lebanon. And we lived in this world here where we were really socialized to become American, to live this, quote, American dream. But really, these were code words, if you will, to think about the way whiteness perpetuates itself and this colonist structure that perpetuates itself. Because there was a hierarchy here that we were not aware of until really we bumped into, until I started bumping into it and searching more on my identity. So there's a process that has to start happening, especially for people in white bodies. I think race is at the core essence of a lot of this. And if we can't face it or don't see it, then it's going to be hard. But I do believe culture can influence it, but it has to be intentional. And I also appreciate what I'm hearing also from Robert as well, bringing into this conversation. We also have to understand where we're coming from, because it is going to be a different context. I want to share with you something, an email that I received from my daughter, is in 5th grade in the US and in a school in Texas. I don't know how familiar people are with the news, the images you might elicit when you hear about the state of Texas. But my daughter, we got what they're covering in social studies this week from her teacher. And in the curriculum, in their social studies, here's what it says: we are going to focus on the 3 colonial regions of the United States, as they name it, called the New England, the Middle colonies, and the Southern colonies, so that we can gain an understanding about how geography impacted their economic gain. So right away, these narratives are continuing to get perpetuated if we don't start disrupting this. So this is going to take parents. Believe me, I just got this last night, and I will be having a conversation with my teacher. But this is how these things get perpetuated. So intentionally, we have to pause and think about how we have been socialized into this, because there is a cycle of socialization. And if any of you are familiar, there's a really great framework by Bobby Harrow called The Cycle of Socialization that shows, especially in the Western constructs, of how we're continuing to perpetuate the status quo and allow things to continue. But just from a high level, right, I think the way that if we are not, number one, having these conversations and raising awareness, we can't confront this legacy. It's going to just continue. And I think we're living in a time where we can at least start these conversations and taking these actions, because it is difficult to shift at a macro level. But if all of us are doing a little something from somewhere based on how we have been socialized, racially socialized, and centering race in this conversation, then we can start raising critical consciousness. We can start making it visible. We can start having dialogue, and so on. So I'll just stop there. That's kind of the first thing. I have a lot of thoughts when this question raises, but I'll pause there. I think those are the key things that come up for me right now.
Thank you, Sonya. You know, when we talk culture, it is always a question of whose culture are we talking about? Because, you know, each person is referring to whatever they think it's the next person's culture. And, you know, with the days that we live in, colonization has actually made the colonized to sometimes doubt their own culture, because you told a lot of the times how wrong your culture is or how incorrect it is, and you are being shifted to thinking of a different type of culture. I'm not a speaker. I'm just here, you know, just adding on to what you were saying earlier on. Any questions, any comments, anyone else? People are deep in thought, digesting what is being said. It's an interesting discussion. It's not a difficult one. It really just gets us to talk. All right, Dr. Meshesha, how do existing structures influence the decolonization in people's minds?
Thank you very much. I would like to build on what Robert and Kris alluded to. My basis of the argument is the colonial legacy, particularly in realm of international voluntarism, which is the agenda of our discussion. We have a glaring imbalance, namely 89 to 90% of international volunteering is coming from the global north. So it's very clear that Africa is dependent on international volunteering coming from the north. And we don't have a corresponding outflow of international volunteering from Africa to the global north. This is one. The second imbalance or disparity we observe is what I can call inter or intra-African volunteering disparity. If you take just this year's data, Africa received close to 3,000 international volunteers. Only out of 55 African countries, about 18%, 18% are predominantly receiving international volunteer. And out of these 10 countries, South Africa is the predominant country receiving international volunteer. Next, followed by Nigeria. Another indication manifest of disparity is inter-African disparity. The trend is many of the African volunteer receiving organizations are receiving volunteers from their former colonial power. So there is a perpetuation of the dependency. This has to be said. So addressing the question that you have assigned to me, taking this as a base, the African Union, I'm speaking from the perspective of the African Union. The African Union is addressing this imbalance, disparity, by coming up with various policy instruments that has got structural ramifications on the member states. If I mention some of the initiatives we have taken, the African Union has taken, particularly since 2006, the first one is the coming into effect of the African Youth Charter. The African Youth Charter is a policy instrument which is meant to reverse that imbalance which I have alluded to provide a strategic framework for youth empowerment and the development activities at a national, regional level. Particularly, Article 11 to H of this charter requires member states to come up with national policies, national volunteering policy. And then the other very pertinent issue is the Agenda 2063. This agenda but it has got 7 aspirations. Out of these 7 aspirations, particularly if I mention the 6th one, which requires or entails unleashing the potential of the African youth. And this Agenda 2063 is instrument of Pan-Africanism and positioning Africa as a dynamic player at a global stage. one instrument that has got an implication on decolonization or deconstruction of dependency is the African Youth Volunteers Corps, which is very innovative continental flagship program that recruits, trains, and deploys young professionals to serve as a professional volunteers for a period of 12 months across the continent. I think this is one very innovative program that the African Union come up to tackle the problem of dependency on the North Side. Just in the interest of time, I'm not going to in the details of these issues. If there is any question, I'll respond. The last is the plan of action on the African Union plan of action on youth empowerment. This is another very important initiative that has got a ramification on the member states to have to broaden the scope of participation of the youth by providing employment, entrepreneurship opportunities, engagement, and also quality education. So in general, a lot is happening at the African Union level to promote Pan-Africanism, collective sovereignty, self and collective self-reliance, and also promotion of interstate solidarity under the ambit of South-South cooperation. So this mechanism, I believe, is contributing toward this decolonization and addressing the negative consequences of colonization, which I have mentioned. I thank you very much. Over to you.
Wow. Thank you, Dr. Meshesha. You alluded to the intra-African volunteerism, which has always been a challenge for over the years. And I think because of the economic dependence within Africa, we struggle to promote volunteerism because we don't have the financial means to do so. And yet we are one of the richest continents in the world, you know? So it is time that we start looking at saying, why are we not able to do it ourselves? Why are we still dependent? So the policies that are written, the guidelines that are they actually talking to us, or we still promoting the colonialism? So just on what you have just said, Dr. Meshesha, does international volunteering support decolonization process? And I know that you have alluded to it a little bit, or is it rather sustaining the colonial structures through the savior mentality, maybe?
Definitely. Thank you very much again for giving me this opportunity. In fact, my answer to this question is it depends. Yes, it may contribute towards addressing the imbalance and the disparity if three conditions are fulfilled. The first is if the international volunteering is aligned with the continental standards, continental policies, strategies, and the programmatic framework set by the African Union, which I have already mentioned. Namely, you have got the African Union Youth Volunteer Corps, which I found it's very innovative. It has built the confidence that Africa can also have a meaningful role in international volunteering, at least within our continental realm. So scaling up this program could be one area where the international volunteering can play. The second is supporting the implementation of the continental policies, which I have also mentioned, the Agenda 2063, the African Youth Charter, the African Union Plan of Action on Youth Empowerment, and which I didn't mention, 1 million by 2021. This is also the initiative of His Excellency Chairperson of the African Union. In fact, now we are working on the successor program. Supporting the member states' effort to develop and implement national volunteer policy strategy programming. This could be one area also where international volunteering can contribute. The second is on focusing on building member states' capacity to institutionalize and mainstream volunteerism in the national development and peace programming. This could be also, if the international volunteering is playing a role around this, yes, it can contribute towards decolonization. The third one is on focus on critical volunteering gaps or programmatic gaps, if you like. What are these? From my perspective, in fact, building the technological capability. This could be in the area of health, digital health, for example. This could be also around job creation, which is very, very important. We have got an army of youth unemployment, which is prone for unwarranted human trafficking, the migration to the north. Food and nutrition security could be also another area. Education, particularly improving the quality of education, linkage between education and the labor market, the climate smart technology, climate change. That could be also another area where the international volunteering can be applied. So instead of really having a duplication, instead of crowding, create a crowding out effect, to use economic jargon, if focusing on the critical gap areas, it can contribute toward this decolonization. Otherwise, if these conditions are not really dually addressed, I'm afraid I would say it would perpetuate the dependency syndrome and the imbalance that we have already mentioned. Thank you very much. Back to you, Madam Chair.
Mary?
Yes, Robert.
Yes, I would like to add something to what Dr. Meshesha just said. I think it is an important point that the continental body or the regional body, the role they can play in helping the countries toward decolonization in terms of volunteering. I work with Meshesha and the African Union on some of these documents, but I want also to mention the case of ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, that has also a volunteer program. And what I can see with my experience helping countries to set up a national volunteer program or writing laws or policies, recently I went to a country just about a few months ago to help them elaborate a law on voluntarism. We spent various meetings, we did a validation workshop, and everything was fine. And then when the document went back to the ministry, one of the advisors of the ministry just copied word by word the law on volunteering from the colonial country and brought that and say, this is the best law. So you can see with what, that's why I'm saying what Dr. Meshesha said, if we can come at a stage whereby these regional or continental body can support the countries to avoid this type of situation, I think it will be very, very helpful. Because we have few countries now that have law, but if you read the law they are of different quality. I counted about 16 countries in Africa with law on voluntarism, but they are at different qualities. Some exactly went back to the colonial country and took their law or part of their law and plugged into a context that is totally different. And the document that Dr. Meshesha was referring to is trying to say, okay, you want to come up with a law. There are some standards that you should respect. You want to develop your national volunteer program. Here are some contracts, because the African Union, unfortunately, cannot oblige a country to do something. They can just recommend. Thank you.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you. So we're talking about linking the Agenda 2063 with the SDGs to make sure that we are on par. Kris, do you have anything to add?
Well, I would like to applaud and reinforce the last speakers, Dr. Meshesha and Robert, on their insisting on African multilateralism. In some of the less boring bits of my writing, I spent time on that. If you look at the conflict I'm trying to be active in Congo, yeah, it became independent, and everything was decided in Brussels and Washington. Yeah, you look 50 years later with the first elections. You see that the European Union was extremely important. Still Washington, but it became more complex. And then something happened, a war, where the African multilateral institutions took leadership. They claimed leadership, they obtained leadership. They wanted to consider Congo as an African problem, and they did not want to be excluded about discussion. And since those days, 2013, 2014, a lot of things have changed. Africa became much more important in how the international community deals with Congo. And that's only possible because of strong African multilateral institutions. So what has been said here by Dr. Meshesha and Robert about volunteering and the importance of multilateralism, African multilateralism, it goes far beyond that. I believe that the emancipation of Africa, the empowerment of Africa, Africa being able of defining and solving its own problems goes through strong African institutions. So I thought that was very important.
Indeed. Sonya, your comments on the last two speakers?
Yeah, I really appreciated what Dr. Meshesha shared about understanding these critical gap areas and just being intentional with it. Because if we're not, we will perpetuate because it's what we know. And I think this is where, for me personally, as I see some of this, there's this macro work and policies that all must be addressed, and we need them. Yes, we need them. And there's the mental models and belief systems that we hold depending on the culture. And I love, Mary, that you brought that up too. It's just, how are we even defining culture? We need to consider this as well, and our individual roles and how we perpetuate it. And I put that question out too, especially to people who have forms of privilege, right? And we've got to understand where power and privilege live. Otherwise, these systems will continue to perpetuate. But just what Dr. Meshesha has shared has just really, thank you, right? And Robert especially, and Kris, because all of you are working in this space. I don't necessarily work in the international volunteer space, but I was one of those international volunteers, right? That early on, back in the 90s, went to, go help, go do good, go do good. And this is what was shared in a belief system, right, that you would do. So yes, policies, we need these, and we need to keep questioning these mental models and cultural frameworks that are upholding some of these systems as well.
All right. Dr. Meshesha, do you want to comment?
No.
All right. No, because I was just thinking something I said to Ingrid the other day, that there's a very interesting African saying that I like, that until the lion learns to write its own story, it's very common, and it's very sad that, Kris rightfully says all these things, all these conferences are happening in Brussels and in somewhere in Washington, and the majority of the people that are there, because most of us, or most of the people with this radical way of thinking, with radical policies to transform the colonial systems, do not actually have the means and the money to get there. So the majority of the people that are there making those decisions are still the hunters that are still praising themselves. So we still have got a long way to go. But it's good that we started talking about these things. I'm going to open the floor for the audience before we move on to the next part of the questions. I think if we had an opportunity to just start to jack your mind, to start thinking about what goes on, to start thinking about the SDG, Agenda 2030, it's just around the corner. Are we ready? Are we transformed? 2063, will we have everybody on par? I know Dr. Meshesha spoke a lot about these things, that we're getting there, but are we really getting there? We need to think about it. So let's talk. Audience, any questions, any comments?
Mary, I just wanted to ask the attention of everybody for one moment, because I noticed that in the room, as you called it, we have a very diverse audience, and there's people from different parts of the world, not only from Europe and Africa. So we have Sonya from the States, but there's also several people from Asia. So I would also welcome people who have other ideas about colonialization, decolonization from a different perspective, to also feel free to share or to bring in their perspectives, yes? Because I think we're very much focused here on Europe, Africa, because this was a bit where we started from when we started thinking about the webinar. But I guess there's also very interesting stories or ideas from other parts of the world. So please feel free if you want to bring in something and share with the rest of the group, yes?
Thank you, Ingrid. You can see that it's Europe and Africa that came up with this. So thank you, Ingrid. I've noted 2 hands. Enoch, your hand was up first, and then after Enoch, Anita, you're next. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for your hand. You can go ahead, Enoch.
Thank you, Mary. Hello, everybody. I think this discussion is getting everybody uncomfortable, I may say, because like we've been having this conversation at various regional meetings, international body meetings. You know, colonialism is there. It's there, it has been there, and we are trying to address it, even in the movements that we're leading in South Africa. The question is, are we taking it slowly and having policies and everything there in parliament and everything that we say this is something that we need to address, but yet it gathers dust and everything? Are the youth of today able to take this question and address it in their communities, in their societies that they are living in as such? So my question is like, is this going to be a one-off thing that we have the webinar and it's finished and ever? But are we continuing this discussion to either in the international meetings that we're going to be having? I would actually take it upon myself in the International Voluntary Service to say, like, let's have this discussion and let's put action into the ways that we are actually coming up from. Thank you.
Thank you, Enoch. Action is the key word. We have conferences and conferences and conferences, and we put together huge documents that end up in some fancy cloud filing somewhere. So action is the key word here. Anita.
Can you hear me? Because
now we
can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so
It's coming and going, Anita. We can't hear you now.
okay. Now
There's
better?
a lot of noise in the background also, but yeah.
But I'm alone. You hear ghosts in my... Okay. No, it's not working. Okay.
Yeah.
How about you go on and maybe I write it down in the chat.
No. We hear you, but you have to focus clearly in the microphone, I think.
Okay. I project like an opera singer. Yeah, so I'm from Italy, and as I was saying, I am now currently studying in Hong Kong, and my PhD is about international voluntary service in the tradition of IVS that is now still brought on by organizations network like CCIVS or SCI. And in terms of my experience on this, and I will try to be as brief as possible, myself, I was aware that I was doing colonialism in coming to Asia from Europe and studying something that is international, but having myself a focus on organizations that are in this side of the world. And so I asked my professors, I need to do a lot of work in methodology to check my own position in this and in what way my research can be perpetrating, can be reaffirming this asymmetry, this inequality in power. And I was told by Hong Kong professor, for example, oh, no, you don't need to be ashamed to be white. And of course, it was not only this professor, but I saw after this that there is this general understanding about, we don't talk about this stuff, right? And in a sense, this episode that I just talked about is also talking about how colonialism can be internalized by the people that were colonized. And this happens, of course, also in volunteering experiences. And until now, we have been talking a lot about what is to be done with this idea of the future, but my small contribution that comes from the 4 years that I spent on this topic is about the fact that there is a lot that has been done. Sometimes it looks like as if in universities we are waking up now and we think that all the work has to be done about, oh, let's talk about colonialism, let's look at it, let's ask questions. But the organizations that have been going on doing international volunteering for the past 100 years, they have been looking at this starting from the 90s. There are written documents, there have been conversations, that have been policies, internal organizational policies to solve this situation. And so it would be interesting to take a look at that. And in my modest look at that, what I saw is that there is a very effective tool that has been developed in this many years, which is the training for volunteers. This training is a specific one that is not about logistics. It's not about which plane and which train you have to take. And it's about equity, diversity, and inclusion, as it is called now in academia, but is about letting the diversity emerge and look at it and learning ways to cope and to create a safe space for everybody. And this is done in with methods of experiential learning or a pedagogy that is inclusive. So now I'm very grateful for all the speakers that intervened. I was wondering though if the language that at some point was used was accessible to everybody. And also when we go into the policy level, are we responding as experts to the needs of the organizations that work on the ground? And so when this is why I'm bringing things on a more practical level. And the issue with training is that that can also reproduce some form of colonialism, because if we look at who gets trained, the organizations that have more resources, they can organize more training. So the training is not equally standardized and distributed. The good part of that, though, is that the Western volunteers, let's call it Western, that are trained, when they come and have their experiences, for example, in Asia, in Eastern Asia, they are able to share those tools. And they are able to share them in a pedagogy of inclusion. So it's not about I'm going to teach you, but it's about let's do this together in this equal way. They are able to break stereotypes. Still, the standardization would be the best. And one other small thing is about making differences between who is doing this kind of thing, who has been participating in this kind of discussions, because we are talking about international volunteering, but there are several different ways to do international volunteering. And I am talking about IVS, which is a specific kind of tradition, but the scenario is very, very different if we look at voluntourism or development style of volunteering, which is called in academia V4D, volunteering for development, in the past 10-ish years. And in that, I conclude with this, sorry for taking so much space, but then I will shut up, promise. In talking about, in considering the possibility of development volunteer, and because the SDGs have been already mentioned, then my question for the speakers and for every one of us is development the goal? Because who invented development, and in what way development was achieved by the countries that call themselves developed now? And this becomes kind of a rhetorical question if we look at how the SDGs have been emerging from the Millennium Goals and the previous discussions, because they perpetuate a very specific shape of development that is not sensitive to context very much, that is very focused on the effect. It says no hunger. It doesn't say land sovereignty for everybody. It says economic support. It doesn't say universal basic income. It says that, yeah, on the no hunger one, it's done in a way for which small local movements of land sovereignty, they cannot apply for funding, and McDonald's is getting funding for that. And so is development really the goal? And just to conclude, the social justice and peace in the SDGs occupy the very least urgency of the list of the SDGs themselves. They are very much at the bottom. And instead, these other goals that are very enterprise friendly, they are very much at the top. And so we have McDonald's getting more funding, and Microsoft and the Belinda and Bill Gates Foundation getting more funding for this. So yeah, okay, I dropped my bomb, and and this was it. Let's talk about it.
Thank you, Anita. You indeed dropped the bomb about the SDGs. You kind of exposing the weaknesses. Okay, Edward.
Good evening, everyone. So I'll keep it sweet and simple. My question is that, I mean, the conversation about decolonizing volunteering, you know, it happens in many levels, right? And we are all here from different organizations. I mean, my question is, you know, to learn from all of you, what is the role of the hosting organization and the sending organization? Or is there an imbalance in terms of re-educating or sharing, you know, to change this concept? You know, is it you focus more on the sending organization that is usually from a higher income, you know, or from the north or for a more developed country? Or there is also the receiving organization should also do their part. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Edward. Enoch, did you have your hand up again?
No, man.
Okay, it was an old hand. Anita?
Yeah.
Thank you, Enoch. No, you forgot to drop your hand, Anita. Okay, any of my panelists that would like to comment on the last two people, especially from Edward, about the sending and the hosting organizations?
May I?
Yes, Robert.
Is Robert or Meshesha?
Oh, my apologies. Dr. Meshesha, apologies.
Yes, no, it's okay. In fact, I will be very, very quick. That of Enoch, I think very provocative. I fully share your frustration, disappointment, as regard to a lot of talking, is a lot of policy making, programming, but there is a deficit of action, proportionate action. Although I understand your disappointment a little bit, I do have also some cautious optimism, because since 2006, both on the policy front, programming front, and action operation, a lot of things are happening within the African continent. I have mentioned that the African Union came up in 2010 with the African Union Youth Volunteers Corps. In 2006, the African Union came with the Youth Charter, which requires member states to put in place national volunteering policy. This is towards self-reliance as regard to volunteerism. By the way, volunteerism is home. It's a culture to Africa. This has to be really said. We are talking about international volunteering, not the volunteering in general. 89, according to one study, from 85 up to 90% of the African people are annually volunteering. We have got, that's why we are surviving. This is our social capital. But this is a defining feature of the African culture. That has to be really underscored. So we are really emphasizing the deficit lies with cross-country voluntarism. This is a place where we are really having the missing link. On the third, which Robert mentioned, there is a platform which I am currently coordinating, Continental Volunteer Linkage Platform, which is meant to promote minimum standards, common principles, taking into consideration of the local context. Africa is not a village. It's not one country. You have got 55 countries having a diversity of culture. The level of development, institutional development is quite different. We do have countries who have really advanced, well advanced as regard to institutionalization of volunteerism. At the same time, we do have some countries lacking. So what we have, which Robert already alluded to, currently we have initiated to craft a model policy which would serve as hands-on guide, not really a dictate. But the member countries are not required to copy. Based on the African best practices, we are going to craft a model. This would help. So a lot of things are really happening, but we have to be patient. Particularly decolonization of mind is bound to be protracted. You can't really tackle overnight, but I hope we do have some reason that makes us really to be cautiously optimistic. On the role Edward has raised, yes, I have already mentioned that thing. On the local part, the ensuring the ownership, particularly of the government, to assign money for volunteerism. You might have a policy, you might have a program, but you don't have money allocated, sustainably allocated, because volunteerism requires also money. Although it is pro bono, you are not really implementing or doing it without incurring some cost. So that is one policy framework, program framework, and allocating local resources. The localization of the resources is very, very important, that will reduce dependency on external force. On the role of the international one, I did mention this one. You shouldn't really duplicate. You shouldn't really duplicate volunteerism as you know it in your respective countries. So you have to align with our policies, strategies, and focus on the critical gaps. And your role should be on capacity building and enablement of the national institutions. This is what I would like to say. Anita, I liked your provocative. Since I am coming from the African Union, I don't want to really comment, because that construct is not academic construct. Since I'm working for the African Union, I have to be very cautious of going into it. But as a development economist, I am the ardent supporter of the Amartya Sen's understanding of development as a freedom, development that ensures human dignity, that ensures a freedom of choice. Thank you very much indeed. Back to you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Dr. Meshesha. Sonya, Edward would like to hear your views, please.
Yeah, I will share, but Robert, maybe go please first. Robert, I heard you have something.
Okay, all right, okay, sure.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to quickly talk about the role of hosting and sending organization. I think that can happen at different levels, as he rightly said. It could be in terms of bilateral type of volunteering, where it's a understanding between two countries, or it can happen at level of country to civil society organization. About 1 or 2 years ago, I worked on a document for the German GIZ, because they had this initiative that they call the African German Youth Initiative, and this was piloted in South Africa, Benin, and Tanzania. And the work I'd done was mainly for Benin. What I did was to come up with good practices, best practices on exactly this relationship between the sending and the host organization. And the end product, we came up with a label, a quality label that currently in Benin, they are piloting this label. And one important thing that we saw was exactly that it is important to have a clear memorandum of understanding between the host organization and the sending organization. And even we notice a third actor, who are the intermediary organization, who sometimes just will negotiate with volunteer and then go and place them with other organizations. So it's very, very important to have this clear memorandum of understanding in terms of who is doing what, who is controlling what. Because when I sent a questionnaire to some of organizations, some sending organization will directly contact their volunteer. The volunteers are sending report to their organization without showing it to the host organization. And that's create a lot of problem, because One day they will receive a letter saying, you know, you are doing this, we don't agree. But if everything is clear from the beginning, it's help. And I'm not coming back on the training aspect that was mentioned by Anita. I think that is also key. The training should not just take place in the sending country and the volunteer arrive, no training in the host country. And even the two training by the host and the sending organization, they should talk to each other before they can come up with what will be the content of the two training, be it in the sending country or in the receiving country. Thank you.
Over to you, Sonya.
Yeah, so there's so many thoughts going through my head right now. This is such a rich, rich conversation. I think what's opening up, I mean, I just love what was shared, especially Robert, what you just shared. What I heard from you is this idea of kind of more of a co-creation. And how might we lean into more co-creation, right? And Dr. Meshesha, what you shared about this is a journey. This is going to take time, and we're taking steps, and everyone is at a differing place with this. But it has to start somewhere with conversation, and we will get to action. I think there is action happening right on some level, and there needs to be more. I think the only thing I can share right now, because there's so much going through my head, and I am such a processor. I like to really think. It's one of my struggles being on a panel is I do like to think, and I'd love to go deeper, but there's a quote I'll share by Audre Lorde that really, if any of you are familiar with her, she's an activist. She's an American woman, a Black woman, feminist, just really, I follow her a lot, and she's influenced my thinking. And she shared a quote that seems relevant here. And her quote is, "For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us to temporarily beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change." And that really, what it resonates for me is the tools that we're using. And I think we're in a time where we're questioning even more so, not that it's new, it's not a new conversation. It's been around for, we could say, a few thousand years here, right? It's been around for a while, since the beginning of this idea of colonization began, rooted out of Europe, right? We've got to name some of these things. And I live in a country where I am complicit in some of these systems that continue to keep this machine going until I intentionally turn and try to disrupt it. And I think that's what we also have to start thinking of this and leaning into some new tools. What are new ways? And this is what I loved about what Robert brought into the space of the co-creation, of conversation, of understanding. So that's all I have to share right now. That's all that's opening for me from this just very powerful exchange from the speakers. So thank you, everyone, and for people participating.
This conversation has to keep going. And Dr. Meshesha, thank you for reminding everybody that Africa is a continent with over 50 countries in it. And you know, some people just don't get it, you know. So Sonya, I'm going to ask you, because you started talking into what you're taking away from here. I mean, you started quoting what Robert said and who said what. So I want you to tell us what you, as a speaker, over and above what you've just mentioned, what are you taking away from this discussion?
I'm taking away that, well, so much. From a very high level, I guess just to say that we still have barriers. They're there, right? And if enough of us can continue to lean in to find some new possibility, I think we can continue to move. I don't know if we're ever going to see this in our lifetime. However, I see the future, and I see that international volunteerism can really be an opportunity if we're thoughtful about it and take a co-creation approach. We can look at dismantling and reimagining, because there's this work of deconstruction and this reimagining ways. And I think I was a little bit more cynical prior to coming in, but I've also now walking away with there's actually some things that are being done as well, right? And I think as long as we can keep moving toward that. So I don't know if that makes so much sense, but I'm just walking away with just some new insights and also just some more questions as well.
Okay, all right. And would you have, or do you have any recommendations for the international volunteer organizations and maybe the volunteers themselves?
You know, I would say recommendations, I always like to look at our role as individuals because we are part of these systems, right? I think we talk about systems as out there. We are part of the system. So where can we influence change from our sphere of influence? And it makes, because sometimes when we start opening up this conversation and see how it is, we think we might need to boil the ocean, right? And we don't need to boil the ocean, if that metaphor can make sense, right? But where can we take, it's not like we have to take everything on, but where can we, in our sphere of influence, where can we pull some levers? And it all starts with ourselves as well, and then being in conversation and exchange with others. So I would say continually to assess how we can raise critical consciousness also within ourselves and continue to do the work as well around it in the way we've been socialized into this, and find ways that we can really, we have to be intentional. Because if we're not intentional, we will continue to perpetuate this. So I would just say, keep asking, being in conversation, staying in action as well where we can. That would be my recommendation. And I know that's quite broad, but we all have to find where we are in those journeys.
Thank you, Sonya. Robert, I am going to steal from the SDGs 2030 transformational promise that we're leaving no one behind. Please tell us, how do you think we're going to do this, not to leave anyone behind? You're taking away from here your recommendations, if you've got any. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you. I think my takeaway, again, is, for me, is action. It's good to talk. It's very nice. We are very informative. We're getting a lot of idea. We're sharing information, but it's better to walk the talk. And so my takeaway is around that. I will just give a very short example. The French volunteer program called France Volontaire has started this special program called the Reciprocity Voluntourism, whereby they accept few volunteers from the former French colonies to go to France to volunteer, as well as they are sending volunteers to of course, the number of people going to France is much, much more lower than the number of people coming from France to Africa. So they organized this meeting in Togo with some of the national volunteer program. And at the end of the program, I asked some of the people coming from the African country, so what are you going to do next? Because the idea was how to promote better this reciprocity program between France and the African countries. But when we met among African, we decided that we can do it also in Africa. And currently in the ECOWAS space, there are already some countries who started doing that. For instance, Togo sent volunteers to Mali, and Mali sent volunteers to Togo. Burkina has signed MOU with Benin and Mali, and they are starting to do that. So for me, action is very important. In terms of recommendation, I think it's again a lot of awareness raising and also lobbying. And lobbying also mainly by the volunteer involvement organization that we have already, the national one, and in general, the civil society organization. Because my experience is that most of the country today where we have a national volunteer program, the idea initially come from civil society organization. They have one who push their country to go through that using what Dr. Meshesha has referred to, the African Youth Charter, where it was clearly said that they have to establish national volunteer program. So civil society organizations use that to push their government to set up his program, to put money in it. And in most of his country, you have a national budget line on volunteers so that they don't rely on external resources, but first on their own resources. Of course, if there are any national assistance, they accept it, but primarily they rely on their national resources. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Kris, I think same question to you, your takeaways and any recommendations if you have any?
Well, I listened to everything, including the frustrations, and I could understand it. And then my main thing is it's not about stereotypes, it's not about love, it's not about empathy, it's not about goodwill. That's maybe where it starts, but it's about changing structures, the question who sets the agenda based on whose premises, and that's important. And that's maybe well, when we will progress a bit, because indeed in some way we are turning in circles. Maybe the terminology changes every now and then, but I agree that these are slow processes, but I think they're very slow. It could be a bit faster, more focused. It's about who sets the agenda.
Okay. All right, thank you. And before Dr. Meshesha gives us his closing comments, Anita has got her hand up.
Hello, thank you. I promised to Mary in the chat that I will not do any bombing, so we can all relax now. Yeah, no, just I don't know what's happening with the microphone. There is some censoring happening. If I'm, okay, again. Just about the events that we were talking about, I mentioned them, and because there are members of NGOs, and Edward was also asking it directly. Yeah, I just wanted to share things that anyone can do tomorrow for zero cost, which are already the result of the 30-ish years of conversation that has been happening in the world of IVS. And I mentioned the EDI, the equality, equity, diversity, and inclusion, with the caveat that it should be standardized and made accessible to all. Secondly, there is a beautiful about breaking the mob in this organization, which means that there are no group programs in which somebody who is from one country go to another country, but every work camp has the structure of the rule of having maximum 2 people that come from the same country, which and these countries can be located everywhere. Of course, there is no Europe, non-Europe kind of thing. And this is incredibly powerful because then the structure of the participants is more mixed and there is less of othering that happens in these projects. And then 3 key points of how these programs work are very, very practical. One is about living together at the same level of the community, within the community, sharing the same spaces, sharing the same food, sharing the same conditions, not having a hostile situation, not having a different situation in which volunteers are placed while the community is staying in their own separate world, which lowers the cost, and working together, which means the roles are circular. There is no such a thing as volunteers coming here or wherever to teach local people, which brings back that comment that was done about having this scarcity mindset that everything that comes from outside is good and when it's inside is not good. And finally, and most importantly, learning together, which in this case means that there has been a structured study part in each program in which the community is the teacher. The community's knowledge is put at the center of the stage, and the volunteers are the learners of that. And this is done in a way that breaks the dynamic of developmentalism, in which the volunteers are brought in from countries that are so-called developed, and so they are seen as the one whose knowledge is more valuable, and instead the indigenous knowledge is put on a lower scale or is dismissed entirely. Each single WordCamp has this component, and it's very transformative. It does work. Unfortunately, I haven't published yet on this, so I cannot remind you to a paper, a fancy journal or something like that, but this thing exists, and so I just wanted to put it there. Sorry for the time.
Sorry.
Again.
Thank you, Anita. Dr. Meshesha, you've got 30 seconds to give us your closing statement, your takeaways and recommendations, if you've got any.
Mary, you are not doing justice to me when you have given. Anyways, my takeaways are, first, what's really resonating with me is the interest for decolonizing international voluntarism. This is one. The second is building on Edward, Robert, Sonya, is the focus on our respective comparative advantage. Each of us have got relative comparative advantage. Nobody has got a monopoly of knowledge on international voluntarism. So we have to focus on our respective relative comparative advantage. On a recommendation, I repeat what I've said, aligned with the African Union and also the member states initiative. Second, avoid fragmentation, which is also related to my first recommendation. The third and the last is, it has been said, I think by Robert, I don't know who said it, so the sense of urgency is very, very important. We have to do it. We have to walk the talk with a sense of exigency and a sense of urgency. Mary, I think this is the 30-second response. Thank you very much. Back to you.
Thank you, Dr. Meshesha. Thank you to everybody, all the panel members and everybody that was in the discussions. I know that some people didn't say anything, but I could see that they were nodding and you could see they were thinking. The opportunity for allowing me to be your moderator, thank you very much. So before I give back to Anna, I just want to say, please let us all remember we are here to talk about decolonizing international volunteering. It is still a question. Is it a dream or a reality? It is up to us to make it a reality. And what I take away from everybody here is action, action, and more action. Thank you for the opportunity, and back to you, Anna.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, very much for your time spending with us here. I think we still have a lot to talk about still in this topic. And for this reason, after we finish we're going to finish very soon, but we will receive afterwards, participants will receive a questionnaire, a survey about the time we spent here. And also we are going to ask you there if you would like to have in the future another meeting like this one. How would you like to this one to be, to still deepen in this topic? So that's from my side. Thank you very much to everyone, to the ones promoting this meeting, to the panelists, to Mary, to moderating this, and people staying with us. Thank you very much.
Yep.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank
Merci
you.
beaucoup.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
Merci.
Merci, Robert.